Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Today we will discuss a timely yet historic book on the First Federal Congress of 1789 through 1791, which was the most momentous and perhaps most productive of our nation's history. The book's title is The First Congress: How James Madison, George Washington, and a group of extraordinary men invented the government. And the author is Fergus Bordovich, who traveled to our studio in Arlington, Virginia from San Francisco, California, where he resides. Welcome to the Bookman's Corner, Fergus.
Hi, Lois. I'm very happy to be here.
As you wrote, when the members of the First Congress met in New York, our nation was fragile, riven by sectional differences, crushed by debt, and stitched together only by the new Constitution. And the Constitution provided a set of principles but offered few instructions about how the government should operate, leaving it to Congress and the President to create the machinery of government. Had Congress failed in its work back in 1789, the United States would not exist today. There were dramatic debates over the Bill of Rights, the creation of the President's cabinet, the adoption of a new capitalistic financial system, and the acrimonious arguments over the location of the new capital, among many other issues. How Congress and President Washington achieved as much as they did is a story that could not be more timely in our era of incredible government gridlock. What inspired you to write it?
Well, some years back, I wrote a history of Washington, particularly how slavery shaped the founding of Washington, D.C., why our capital's here and not some other place. And in the course of doing that, I began to look at the First Congress. One of the First Congress's achievements was to locate the Capitol on the Potomac.
Right.
And it became clear to me that that First Congress, though very poorly understood, I think, by Americans, achieved an enormous amount. It was one of the most prodigiously effective Congresses in American history, and I was astonished to realize that no one had ever written a history of it.
Yes, and I don't think it's widely known. And so let me ask you, what happened to the American government at the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783? Because this took place in 1789. So what happened in that period of time between 1783 and 1789?
Well, the government, such as it was governed by something called the Articles of Confederation, a very, very loose relationship among the states, which mostly regarded themselves as sovereign small nations. It was a failure. Okay. That was Plan A. The Constitution was Plan B. There was no Plan C.
Okay.
The Constitution became necessary, or it was at least driven by the idea that if this new ramshackle country was going to survive, it had to have some kind of strong or stronger central government. Which could weave these 13 disparate states together.
Yes, yes. And then you wrote that the First Congress had 3 sessions between March 1789 and 1791 in 2 temporary capital cities, New York and Philadelphia, and it was charged with creating a new government almost from scratch. But no one, either in Congress or outside it, knew if it would be successful. Briefly, what do you think were the 3 greatest challenges of the First Congress?
Yeah, I want to underscore, as you just did, that this is a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Nobody knew whether Congress was going to succeed. And in fact, nobody really knew even if the congressmen were going to show up.
If they were going to have a quorum, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Many of those who did show up were near panic-stricken at the failure of others. They eventually did. They got down to work. But the crises, probably the greatest crises facing the new government were, well, one, could the Constitution, this sketch, if you like, this notional plan, be turned into a functioning government with institutions that actually worked?
Yes.
Second, the country was in economic freefall, or financial freefall, let's say.
Yes.
It had immense debts hanging over from the Revolution, as did many of the states. Could a new federal government somehow take responsibility for all...
To pay back the countries that loaned the money, right?
Precisely. And another critical question that the new government faced was creating, for example, a national court system.
Yes.
The Constitution provided for that in principle, but the battle over federal courts. Doesn't sound very sexy, I realize, but it was close to violent at the time because it was the first great confrontation over states' rights versus strong central
and
government.
state courts, right? They had state courts in existence.
Yep.
Well, as in the beginning of the United States, it was a shaky assemblage of 11 sovereign states because North Carolina and Rhode Island were still foreign countries. I mean, they were not part of the government, right, in the beginning.
That's quite right. They initially rejected the Constitution, and there was a great concern over whether they were going to come in or not, or what it was going to take to induce them to come in. North Carolina came in without too much stress and strain. Rhode Island was another story. The Rhode Islanders were extremely resistant to the new national government. They defiantly rejected the Constitution, and there was actual talk in Congress in the first session of whether to send troops to the state line, or the national border, I suppose you'd have to say, of Rhode Island, and to bring about regime change in Providence. And fortunately, it didn't come to that.
But yeah, really, it's a miracle, really, that it all came together at the very end there. And what was the difference, really, what was the relationship between the first federal government and the states? I mean, was there a lot of power grabbing going on? And I mean, they were really fighting each other, right?
Well, much of the struggle in that first Congress is over something that's still a matter of debate today: states' rights. What is that relation between the central government and the states? It's as immediate today as
back then, right?
Yeah, it's in the daily newspapers.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Well, you write that John Adams antagonized friends and foes alike. I mean, how did he impact the office of the vice presidency, since he was our first vice president?
Well, the short answer is he diminished it.
He diminished it. How did he do that?
Well, you have to remember, here's Congress. It's a new body.
Yes.
It's a new body. Inventing what Congress is going to do. How is it going to function? George Washington is simultaneously inventing the presidency.
Okay.
John Adams has the responsibility of inventing a vice presidency, and he doesn't do a very good job at it. One, he had a knack for irritating everybody.
Really?
he had what one might unkindly call Nixonian charisma, which is to say that even people who liked him at the beginning got tired of him very quickly.
That's right. He just was kind of obnoxious, I guess, right?
Well, he was. He inserted himself repeatedly into debate in the Senate, which he presided over. That's a duty of the vice president.
Yes.
And senators were extremely annoyed at just about everything he said. He took positions that were almost bizarre. I mean, the thing that really broke the camel's back in terms of the senators' respect for him was his absolute fanatic, even obsessive insistence on grandiose titles for the president.
Okay.
His Majesty and much more than that,
Okay.
Which was so anti-democratic and so much against the spirit of the new government that he alienated people.
Sure. Well, can you describe James Madison's vision for the new government, and what role did he play in forming the government?
Well, Madison, ironically, I say ironically because he was a very small man. He was very short, slender, with a low, whispery voice that was quite difficult to hear, even in the small rooms of the time. So despite that, he is the towering figure, really, of the first and mostly the second session.
Well, because it because of his legal knowledge? He was really brilliant, right? He was just a brilliant man.
He was brilliant. He was not loved. He was not particularly appealing as an individual, but he's that rare example in American history of a man whose credibility rested largely in his intellect. It's very rare in politics.
It is rare. It is rare.
He was understood even by people who didn't like him to know more about the Constitution than anyone else.
Good.
Even his enemies listened to him. He was
so he had a lot of respect.
He had immense respect.
Yes.
He had the confidence of George Washington, which was like political money in the bank.
Yes.
And he had indeed a vision
Okay.
for the government, which is to say a strong central government, a creative government, a government that could act.
That's so important. It's
Yeah.
so important. Now, how did you conduct your research for this book? Because you have so many interesting facts and figures and.
I was living in Washington when I wrote this book.
Okay.
I used the Library of Congress to a great degree, but I've benefited immensely from something called the First Federal Congress Project.
Okay.
And I essentially stood on their shoulders. This is a project under the auspices of George Washington University, which for the last 50 years has been collecting every known piece of writing by a member of the First Congress or about the First Congress during its contemporary period. And the small group of scholars of the First Federal Congress Project opened their office to me, they opened their archives to me, and their guidance, I would say, was invaluable.
The first Congress of the United States established a high watermark for U.S. legislative achievement. What do you think were the four greatest legislative achievements in your mind?
Of the First Congress?
Of the first Congress.
Well, there's no question that the greatest is breathing life into the Constitution, getting it up on its feet, teaching it to walk, and to live.
Yes, implementing it, right?
Implementing it.
Yes.
This is immense. Second, I think today we have to say that the crafting of what we call the Bill of Rights,
Yes.
they didn't call it the Bill of Rights. They just
amendments, right?
They referred to amendments or alterations or something of that sort. At the time, very few people took the Bill of Rights as seriously as we do today.
Yes.
No one regarded it as divinely inspired, sacred, or anything else. Many, many members of the First Congress thought it was frankly a waste of time.
Yes, I was amazed to read that. Yes.
Yeah, that these were trivial,
Yes, right.
trivial issues.
Right.
And others felt that to amend the Constitution would alter it in a way that might, in fact, require a new constitutional convention, which nobody wanted.
Of course, yes.
Which nobody wanted. So, breathing life into the Constitution, Bill of Rights. I think one has to say the creation of the national court system.
Yes. And then the executive branch, right? Do you think that they...
The Congress created all the executive departments. Now, all in those days was 4.
Yes.
Not very many.
But still, it was...
Yes. And you could say that what Congress did was to really create the executive branch.
Which was enormous.
You had this extraordinary individual, George Washington, who was absolutely the right man at the right time, who was inspired in his modest yet firm
But he was such
crafting
a
of the
hero.
presidency. Yes.
People loved him, and he was so admired.
But I think it's important to say, or to realize, that George Washington and everybody else regarded Congress as the leading branch of government, not the presidency. George Washington didn't turn up with an agenda for his first 100 days or anything of the sort.
Yes.
He waited for Congress
to act, that's right, to go forward.
Yep.
Now, we're learning a lot about Alexander Hamilton now because of the tremendous success of the Broadway show about him. What was his major role in 1789?
Okay, well, bear in mind that Alexander Hamilton neither danced nor sang.
Okay.
And yes, he was on Broadway, but Broadway was about...
But he was very handsome. But he was very handsome.
He was indeed. He was indeed, and he was recognized as that by many ladies.
Yes, that's right. We can't forget that. He was tall, good-looking.
He was short and good-looking.
Oh, short and good-looking, okay. But he was very dynamic, yes. And very quick-minded. And
Brilliant.
Brilliant
Man.
And now, how did George Washington relate to Hamilton? What was their relationship?
Well, Hamilton had been an aide-de-camp to Washington during the Revolutionary War. He was excellent in the job. Washington relied on him a great deal. Hamilton also was a hero of the war. He argued with Washington until Washington let him go into combat because Hamilton wanted to fight, and he led the final charge at the Battle of Yorktown. Ooh. Over the British battlements. Very, very brave individual. So Washington admired him. He recognized him. Washington had that skill that some leaders have of knowing of being able to pick superb aides and advisors. That applies to James Madison as well. So Washington trusted Hamilton. Hamilton also was one of the first men in the United States to actually study economics and finance,
Yes.
which was an unknown science
Yes.
at the time.
And didn't he graduate from Columbia University? Didn't he have a college degree?
No, but he did go to Columbia.
He did go to Columbia. Okay.
It did, and he had certainly the equivalent of what today we would call a college education because he further educated himself.
Okay. Now, what was the difference between the British system and the new government of the United States?
Well, that was actually a question that members of the First Congress wrestled with.
How are we different, right?
How are we different? Is the president a king or is he something else?
Yes.
And part of Washington's achievement was to not be kingly and to defer repeatedly to Congress. So as I said a little while ago, Congress was the driving engine of the government.
Okay.
And bear in mind, it's a much smaller Congress.
Right.
You have 20-odd senators and 59 congressmen that could all fit in a pretty small room.
Yes.
So there was Parliament in Britain was balanced quite differently.
Yes. And the king had a big role, or the monarch, right?
Yes, he did. The king at that time, the king certainly did have a role, and one that Americans remembered as being a dark and dangerous one.
Yes, too much power, right?
Too much power.
Right.
And Americans were constrained to try to control, reduce, diminish, and rein in the power of the president. James Madison, by the way, I should say, from the beginning, worked as hard as he could to increase the power of the presidency because he felt, rightly, I think, that the executive needed to be able to act.
Yes, yes. Now, what was the historic rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton?
Well, they sure didn't like each other.
They didn't. And why not?
Well, the rivalry really began over Hamilton's financial plan. In short, Hamilton's plan did the following. One, it consolidated the huge debts of the various states, plus the debt inherited from the ramshackle Articles of Confederation government into one big lump, took that burden onto the new federal government. This strengthened the central government a great deal.
Sure.
Okay, by consolidating financial responsibility in it and the ability to borrow.
Right, but and then didn't they sort of like sell government bonds? I mean, was that the idea to pay down the debt? What was this?
Well, in order to pay down the debt, they first had to create a revenue stream, which they did through tariffs.
Tariffs, okay.
Primarily, not direct taxes of any kind.
Yes.
Okay, so Hamilton was a financial man, an architect of this financial system. Thomas Jefferson was a small government man. He was, in fact, the father of states' rights. You have to say.
Yes, and he was like the president of Virginia in a way, right? The governor. I mean, he had been the governor of Virginia. Yes.
Yes, and then he increasingly resents and resists power being drawn to the center, and articulates the interests of the individual states.
Yes, yes.
And that's the root of the two men's rivalry. They didn't like each other. They didn't trust each other.
Right.
They undermined each other.
So that's what happened.
Yeah.
Well, did George Washington hold many cabinet meetings, and who were the leading members of his cabinet?
I don't think he ever held a cabinet meeting.
Really?
He met individually with them. Bear in mind, there are only 4 of them, and every's living about 3 blocks from everybody else.
Right.
So it's pretty easy.
In New York, right?
In New York City.
Yes.
New York City is our first capital.
Right.
He met with them as needed. During the development of the financial program, he met regularly with Hamilton. And during that period, Washington moved closer and closer and closer to Hamilton and further away from Madison, who increasingly was drawn into Thomas Jefferson's angle of vision of a greater suspicion of central government.
Was George Washington the smartest guy in the room? Did he make the decisions, or was he pretty much deferring to others? I mean, what do you think?
Most of the time he's deferring to others.
Okay.
Is he the smartest man in the room? He was not well educated. He had great sensitivity about that. But he did have this knack for finding brilliant people.
And managing them somehow. Yes.
Managing them and learning from them.
Okay.
He had, if not a first-class intellect, he had an excellent intellect.
Yes. How did Hamilton contribute ideas on improving the country's economy?
Part of his comprehensive financial program, very, very sophisticated program. It had a lot of different parts. There was the consolidation of the debt, which we already talked about. Another was the creation of a national bank based in principle on the idea of the Bank of England.
Okay.
Hamilton was accused, with some truth, I think, to looking to England as the model for everything.
Okay.
What would this national bank do? It would hold the wealth of the government. Revenues would be deposited there.
So you had a central place to put the money,
Correct.
right? Yes, and to manage it. Yes.
Yeah, and it would also, let us say, entrepreneurially lend money out.
And then charge it for
Correct.
interest. Yes,
Charge
right.
interest.
Yes.
Modern banking. This
Yes.
is the birth of modern banking,
Yes.
which was a new idea
Yeah,
to
incredible,
Americans.
incredible.
There were only, at the time, 2 banks in the United States.
Yeah, so it was really new.
Very controversial, though.
Yes, and now the first Congress had opposing interests and ideological differences, and they were self-dealing. It's almost as if I'm reading about today's Congress, except that they had no staff to act as go-betweens. I mean, how did the first Congress work things out?
Well, it's hard to imagine Congress without any staff.
It's hard to
None.
believe.
None. No one had any, not even a secretary. Nothing.
So it was just the individual men, and they were all men. They were
Yes.
all men,
Yes.
and they all had to. Did they meet in bars? Did they have coffee together? What do you think they did?
Well, all of the above.
Okay.
Of course, they did meet in Federal Hall on Wall Street in New York City in regular session. There was a multitude of committees, just as there is today.
Okay.
So individual members belonged to many, many, many committees.
But so it was more one-on-one communication, wasn't it?
Yes, but they did in fact meet in taverns. They did a lot of their work in taverns, hoisting a few. And there was a place called the Coffee House down the block.
Okay, so they got a lot done, really.
They did, yeah.
Now, how did the first Congress handle the slavery issue, especially when Benjamin Franklin, who was quite literally on his deathbed, calls for Congress to abolish slavery?
Yeah, well, you could say this is the signal failure of the first Congress to deal with slavery. Slavery is clearly accepted in the Constitution, although the word never appears. Nonetheless, the Constitution has guaranteed slavery to those states that have it.
Right.
Quakers from Philadelphia and New York came to New York en masse and launched the first lobbying campaign in American political history. Literally, it's where the term comes from. They went into the lobby of Federal Hall, they buttonholed members of Congress with petitions calling for Congress to commit itself to an end to the slave trade and implicitly also to end slavery itself.
Yes.
It caused a tremendous controversy, and it drove Southern members of Congress, and this is 1789 and 90, to threaten secession over slavery.
Yes, it was very dramatic,
Yeah.
yes. Now, what about the Shays Rebellion? It's almost forgotten, but it loomed large in the minds of many members of the first Congress. I mean, can you elaborate on Shays Rebellion?
Sure. It took place in Massachusetts.
Okay.
There were a number of similar protests in other states, but Shays Rebellion was a protest, a violent protest of rural farmers in western Massachusetts protesting against taxes, primarily state taxes, not federal taxes. There weren't any.
State taxes, okay.
State taxes. Massachusetts was one of the most indebted states.
Okay.
So it levied taxes. The farmers were crushed by them. These farmers, many of them, probably most of them, veterans of the Revolutionary War, took the old musket down from the wall and they mobbed judges, courts, and so on. There were deaths. Massachusetts had to mobilize militia
Okay.
Paid for by wealthy Bostonians who
So,
felt.
so they handled the whole thing on a state level, though, right?
Yes, it was on a state level, but as you said, it loomed large in the minds of Congress. The feeling was, if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. There could be discontented people any place.
That's right.
They may take that gun down, and there had been an incident some years earlier during the old Congress where Pennsylvania ex-soldiers had in fact taken the Pennsylvania legislature hostage.
Yes, it's this miracle it all worked out, really.
Yeah.
Now, and you described how can you describe the country ethnically at that time? You wrote that half of the country's population of just under 3 million people were of English stock, but what about the rest?
Well, who are Americans in 1789? Okay, in the sense that we use the word ethnic, yes, most were of English stock, Scots-Irish,
Yes.
more in the South.
Yes.
Some Irish, Irish Catholics, not the huge numbers that would come later. Some Germans, particularly in Pennsylvania. But the real divisions among the population had less to do with their European origins than with what states they belonged to, because people of different states thought of themselves as citizens of a state before being citizens of the country. And there's a Pennsylvania congressman who at one point says, "The deliberations of New Yorkers are as meaningful to me as those in Grand Cairo in Egypt."
So there again, it was people really identify with their states.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what about the settlers in the western states back in 1790? They were begging for laws and protection, and they were hoping they thought they might be better off as subjects of the Spanish government. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, imagine the landscape at the time. Settlers are pouring across the Appalachians from the seaboard states, settling the Ohio Valley, the interior of Georgia, running up against Indians everywhere. Everywhere. There are very, very violent and bloody Indian wars taking place in what was then called the West.
Yes.
The West being Kentucky,
Right.
present-day Tennessee, Ohio, and so on.
Right.
And yes, there's no law and order. The government, the old congressional government, couldn't protect anybody west of the Appalachians. People are pretty much on their own. And yes, indeed, there were many letters written by settlers to Congress in New York and then later Philadelphia saying, we need protection. Look, the Spanish will be happy to have us, or the British in Canada will be happy to have us.
It's a miracle that they didn't become subjects of the Spanish Empire, right?
Yeah.
And before we leave, I want you to tell our viewers where they can find your book in Arlington.
Well, they can certainly find it, I hope, at their favorite local bookstore, certainly from Amazon Books, Barnes & Noble online,
Great.
Or via my own website, that's fergusbordewick.com.
Oh, Fergus, thank you so much for being a guest author on the Bookman's Corner. Your book is fabulous, and I hope many people rush out and get it. It was a great read.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure. And thank you for joining us. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.